All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're very happy to have Tom Bailey with us as part of an author's exhibit he's going to give on a new book that he's written called The Five Capitals of Alabama, the story of Alabama's capital cities from St. Stephen's to Montgomery. Um, uh, this book has just come out, and he's going to give a little brief overview of it. And if you have any questions throughout it, if you'll go ahead and just drop those into the chat, I can monitor that. And when it's done, I can ask them for Tom, and he can give you some answers at the end. All right, go ahead.
Good. Well, good. I guess it's afternoon now. Good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm not there with you. And I'm going to give you a couple of firsts here. This is the first time I have ever done Zoom. Everything else I've done has been in front of real people. And so if I forget to mash a button and forget to change the pages, just chalk it up to me not knowing what I'm doing very well on this. Number two, I've never done PowerPoint before in my whole life. So this is a trial and error little presentation. It's going to be some words on, this is the only words that I care about you reading that are on the screen now. The rest of it, this PowerPoint consists of pages from the book, Five Capitals of Alabama, not because I care about the words on those pages, but only the images. And I have the images of things that I want to talk about. So don't try and read the pages on the book. I'm going to talk this to you, and hopefully it'll work out. It's a little different not being able to look at people when I talk to them, which I like to do a lot. But in any case, this book was written about 4 or 5 years ago, 3 years ago, as part of the bicentennial celebration. And there were so many books that the powers that be decided this one would come after the bicentennial celebration. I can't decide if they wanted it to be special or if they decided since they'd already invested in it, they might as well go ahead and publish it. Time will tell, I suppose. But I guess I should tell you about the five capitals of Alabama. And first of all, that having five capitals is not very unusual for a state. Georgia and Mississippi, of our neighbor states, Georgia and Mississippi had five apiece, although Mississippi had to claim Natchez 2 times. There was a capital on 2 different occasions to get there. Tennessee had 6. But we had 5, and our 5 are special only because they are ours. They are interesting and unique and have all kind of crazy stories about them. If you're hoping for a summary narrative of the 5 capitals of Alabama, I'm going to disappoint you today. I'm going to tell you stories that I found interesting as I was working on this book about the people, the places, and the government of Alabama. But when I first got this assignment, I couldn't decide if the folks wanted me to write about the people of the capitals, the buildings of the capitals, or the government of the capitals. So I kind of punted and did all 3, sort of, but mainly centered around stories that I just found interesting, and I hope you do. But the 5 capitals in order are St. Stephen's from 1817 to 1818, Huntsville from 1818 to 1819, Cahaba from 1819 to 1826, Tuscaloosa 1826 to 1846, and Montgomery 1846 until the present. How are we going to get to see if this actually works or not? So the St. Stephen's, by the way, was never the state capital, but it was the territory capital, just for accuracy purposes. I think I'll start by telling you how this territory came to be. In the late 1700s, Georgia decided it would be great if they claimed all of this land to their west to the Mississippi River. That would make them a grand place, more powerful, more prestigious. And so they did that, but they were a little bit too weak financially or in strength of other kinds to control all that extra land. So they came upon this idea that they would invite land speculators to locate towns, to build towns out in the territory. And those speculators could pay some money for that privilege, $500,000. Well, lots of politics involved, as you might imagine. The have-nots of Georgia found out what the powers to be in the legislature and governor's office were good. They didn't like it a bit. The power brokers spread some of that money around to the newspaper editors and the politicians and other powerful people, but it still didn't work, and the have-nots rose up in righteous indignation. Well, in the end, lots of lawsuits, improper dealings here, and it was called the Great Yazoo Land Scandal, and those who favored it were called the Yazooists. Well, the Yazooists were kicked out of office, and the people who took over were going to do something about it, but they found themselves shackled with all of these lawsuits over the land deals from the speculators. Well, they didn't know what to do except get out from under them, because they couldn't have enough money to fight the lawsuits, much less support a territory extending all the way to the Mississippi River. So the only offer they had was one from the federal government to just take over this land, and they found it to be a good one. They accepted, and it took several years, but those lawsuits finally disappeared, and the federal government found themselves with a big chunk of land that they decided should be an official United States territory, and they named it the Mississippi Territory. It was big. It was, let me see if I can figure this out. It covered from the Mississippi River all the way to the Georgia line. And it came in three parts, actually. The original was the Mississippi Territory, and that was sort of the Yazoo land scandal area. Then it was like a layer cake, actually, and then later came, a few years later, came the northern half of this land. And then finally, a little later, they acquired the coastal area, the 2 feet of Mississippi and Alabama from the Spanish down Mobile and Biloxi and so forth. It was still huge. There were a lot of pine trees and not many people, but it was an unwieldy thing to govern. And worst of all, the capital was put on the Mississippi River in Natchez. It didn't sit well with the folks in the eastern half of the territory. They felt like Natchez wasn't paying much attention to the eastern half because it was so far away. They had differences. They were hard. It was hard to get from Alabama. What's Alabama now? All the way over to the Mississippi River. The Alabamians, as I'll call them, found themselves a lot different from the people of the Mississippi Territory. People in Alabama, they were beset by hostile neighbors. The Spanish were always giving them trouble. They had combative Indians. They had land claim fights going on with the settlers moving in and just kind of squatting where they wanted to be. Some of these were not genteel folks. Most of them were not. So in the end, the folks in the territory wanted to become a state. There was arguments. Some wanted it to be the whole territory. Some said that was too big. Ultimately, the Alabamians said, not only is it too big, we're not getting the proper attention we should get. So in the end, they decided Mississippi in 1817 became a state, and Alabama at the same time became its own territory. The dividing line is pretty much where it exists today. So there we have a territory, and St. Stephen's is declared the territory capital. It seems like an odd place. It's only an hour north of Mobile, but it was at that point about the only town of any size in the whole territory. And it was useful during the the big Mississippi territory days, because it was on a direct line and a good trail to Natchez. It was also a river port. It's on the Tombigbee River, and river boats came up river to deliver supplies, and they got to this point in the river where there were rapids. It was the northernmost point that boats could go. So the little business set up there to offload the river boats at this place called St. Stephen's, and portage them around the falls, and then load them on boats above the falls, above the rapids, and so they could go on further north up to, I guess, probably Fort Tombigbee, which is in Sumter County. It was also, they had become a trading post for the Native Americans. It was also the place where Aaron Burr, one of our illustrious vice presidents, was arrested when he was under charges of treason. But in the end, when the territorial capital was located here, it became a fairly substantial town. Not a nice town, but substantial. It was wild. Deadwood probably had nothing on St. Stephen's. It was a wild, woolly frontier town. Gunfire, brawling in this place that was referred to as the Old Southwest. But ultimately, it grew into a town with lots of brick buildings, hotels, restaurants, newspapers, stores of every kind, just about everything but church. And I should tell you the story of Lorenzo Dow coming to St. Stephen's. Lorenzo Dow was a Methodist preacher who was the first preacher to deliver the Protestant gospel into the Old Southwest. And in 1803, he heard there were a lot of souls in St. Stephen's that needed saving. And so he went there in hopes of bringing the gospel to this, what they considered a God-forsaken place. It just so happened he arrived on the day that there was a big party going on. The streets were full of drunks and people carrying on and all sorts of matter. And he kind of walked up to the group and said, I hope that you folks would reconsider your way of life. They looked at him and they said, well, we hope you will reconsider your coming to our town, because if you don't get out of here, bad things are going to happen. And after some discussion, he saw he was not making headway and he backed out of town. But before he did, he implored God to curse that town, curse St. Stephen's. He said, before it's over with, I implore you to make St. Stephen's a place where not one brick sits atop another, and it is nothing more than a roosting place for bats and owls. So, things got better. And even Dow, who came back to St. Stephen's several times years later, noted improvements in the quality of the town. A little more civility, and particularly when the territorial government came. The Alabama territory legislature met there for the first time and met with a crisis almost before it began. It has to do with the Senate. As I said earlier, that there weren't many people in Alabama. So the Senate consisted of only 3 representatives. By this time, North Alabama had come probably one of the more populated areas very quickly. And so of the 3 senators, 2 were from Madison County. Robert Beatty of Madison County resigned before he took office. Joseph Carson of Washington County died, leaving only James Titus of Madison County as the sole senator for the legislature. What were they going to do? Titus, being a man of mental means, figured it out. He elected himself president of the body. He appointed a secretary and a doorkeeper. He conducted proceedings with studied formality. He called the council to order. He answered the roll. He voted on bills. When he was completed, he moved for adjournment, voted on his motion, and declared council adjourned. And thus, a crisis in government was averted by this Mr. Titus. Well, they met there and never intended to step in. It wasn't the center of the geographic territory of Alabama, and it was important to those people there that the capital be somewhere close to the center of the state. And after they left, St. Stephen's just kind of dried up. The growth didn't keep pace. The boats had found a way to negotiate those shoals in the river without having to offload and then reload. And there was no longer that need for a direct route to Natchez. Thank goodness, they all said. And come time for the Civil War, the bricks of all those nice buildings were taken apart, loaded up, and carried off for the construction of assault works for the Confederacy. They didn't get all of them at that point, but later on, even into the 1900s, anytime the folks of Washington County needed bricks for a barbecue pit or an outhouse, they knew right where to get them, and truckload by truckload, they carted them off and used them. So I guess the St. Stephen's is scattered in bits and pieces all over Washington County. But as Lorenzo Dow predicted, by the time all was said and done, not one brick sat atop another. And I don't know about the bats and owls, but I suspect there are there. I want to show you a few things to talk about. St. Stephen's is not just wilderness anymore. There's lots of wilderness surrounding it, but the archaeologists have done good digs there, and there are nice improved areas. There are street signs. Some of them just marking trails through the woods, but there are. This is part of where a hotel once stood. I think it's the hotel that where the legislature may have met. But as you can see, their archaeological findings have been pretty interesting, I think. And it's certainly worth going to. Here's my first mess up with the Zoom. I needed to have shown you Lorenzo Dow, who is in the lower left of this page, the minister, the person on the town. So they decided to go to Huntsville for a constitutional convention. After a year, they had petitioned. They were petitioning Congress for Alabama to become a state. And they were getting favorable reports, but first they had to put together a constitution. To do that, they had to find a place. And it's not in the center of Alabama either. But there's a good reason it came there. Not a good reason, but an important reason. And it was one of the most rapidly growing areas of the state, and was the home of some of the most affluent, best, and brightest citizens of Alabama at the time. How it came there is one of those odd things that happened. Clement Comer Clay, a Huntsville resident, was part of the territorial legislature and had been appointed with a committee to locate a permanent capital for the state of Alabama. They did their job, and they recommended Tuscaloosa. Well, unbeknownst to them, at the same time, the first governor, the territorial governor, William White Bibb, had different plans. He had found a place. It's about 15 miles south of Selma. It's beautiful land, flat, sits high above the Alabama River, right at the juncture of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers. It also was on, being on Alabama, it was also the same area. This is the plantation in Cahaba. I'm sure that didn't have anything to do with it. Clay wanted to build the Capitol there. He wanted to, there's nothing there, it was just woods. And he wanted to build a great inland city. And so he, having been a congressman previously, went to Washington using his connections in Congress to get approval for this place that would be named Cahaba. He picked it out by himself, didn't discuss it with the committee. And the thing that he did, probably beneficial to the state, was he persuaded Congress to give him not only a number of acres for the Capitol complex, which was a common practice at that point when territories became states. He also persuaded them to give him a huge chunk of land for free in exchange for rights to sell that land to people who wanted to settle in the new capital city. The idea was he could put a lot of money in the state treasury. It was pretty much empty at that point. Well, this didn't set, as good an idea as it might have been, this didn't sit all that well with Clement Clay, who had worked hard to make a thoughtful recommendation. So, but he also saw that the state needed that money in the treasury, and he knew he couldn't win money talks. But instead, he, in the end, exacted his pound of flesh. There's Mr. Clay. This is down in the territorial legislature, but while Bibb won that battle, Clay won the war, and in agreeing to the Cahaba site, he and his allies exactly followed that Bibb could spend no more than $10,000 on the capital. Now, even in those days, that was not a lot of money. Number two, that state representation would be based on population and not on an equal number of representatives for each county. Well, everyone knew that North Alabama was the most populous, and thus Clay could control a lot of the votes in the legislature with a population-based representation. He agreed that Cahaba would be the capital, would be the quote, end quote, permanent capital, but that decision would be open to review in 1825, 6 years later. Lastly, he persuaded the body that Huntsville would be named the site of the Constitutional Convention and would be the temporary capital until Cahaba actually had some buildings there. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Huntsville and the they have done the most marvelous job with this place where the Constitutional Convention took place. That first picture was of a cabinet shop where they all met. There's a Constitution Village is a reconstruction of several important buildings, and they have these reenactors. It's it's worth going to see. During the legislature, during the legislature, the body had decided they would have a committee to draw up a constitution. And this building in the upper right of this page was just a short walking distance from the cabinet shop, and they met in that building and hammered out the first constitution. Which is there. This body of people we met in Huntsville may have been the most competent, brightest group of legislators the state of Alabama has ever had. They had 18 lawyers, 4 doctors, 2 ministers, a surveyor, a merchant, and 4 farmers among their count. They had also the only Alabamian to ever become the Vice President of the United States, William Rufus King. I want to tell you a story about one member of that body, not because he was the best and the brightest, but he was the most, perhaps, as honorable as any. And I think his character represents the kind of character that we found in that first constitutional convention. His name is Sam Dale. He was Alabama's pioneer, was a hero of the Great Canoe Fight during the Creek War. And during that Creek War, he and William Weatherford, now known, I guess, as Red Eagle, were mortal enemies. Red Eagle was a warrior on the Red Sticks. These men did their best to kill each other, and they would have delighted in doing so. And after the war, William Weatherford disappeared for a time. Some people think he went to live with Andrew Jackson a couple of years until things quieted down. But he did come back to Alabama, worked his way through the camps, got to Montgomery, met a woman, fell in love with her, asked her to marry him, and she agreed. Well, Weatherford knew exactly who he wanted for his best man. He sent word to South Alabama because he knew this man. He knew him for his honesty, his fairness, his integrity, his strength, his unimpeachable word. And that was the kind of man he wanted. And when he asked Sam Dale agreed and was William Weatherford's best man. Now, I guess that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the Capitals, but to me, it speaks to the kind of character that we found in him and other members who represented parts of the state in the convention. So, anyway, I want to tell you about Huntsville a little bit. It wasn't always named Huntsville. It was once named Twickenham. One of the delegates to the Mississippi Territory legislature was Leroy Pope. He lived in where Huntsville is today and was a planner, a lawyer, and sort of a dandy. He loved the name Twickenham. He fancied himself as a distant relative of Alexander Pope, the British poet. In fact, Alexander Pope's home was named Twickenham. So Leroy decided that would be a wonderful name for this town. And when he went to the Mississippi Territory legislature, he persuaded them to give the name Twickenham to him. But when he got home and word got out of what he had done, the common folks of the area were beside themselves. They thought that his efforts had been too high-handed. They thought the name Twickenham was way too British. You know, the British in the United States weren't exactly his buddies at the time. So election time came around, and Pope ran as a representative of what was referred to as the Royal Party. The common folks were all part of what's called the Castor Oil Party. I'm not sure where Castor Oil Party came from, but that group won, beat out the Royal Party candidates, and they went to the Mississippi Territory legislature on the next time. And when they got there, they persuaded that body to change the name of Twickenham to Huntsville in honor of John Hunt, one of the original settlers of the land around the Big Spring that is sort of the centerpiece of Huntsville today. So Huntsville got its name, and Huntsville stayed. Twickenham lives on. It did not disappear entirely. It is the name of a Tony neighborhood. It's not very far from the Constitution Village. Beautiful, stately homes, some of them available for touring, and as this, you can see in this picture on the screen, I hope it's there. There are walking tours, and I would encourage you, if you decide to visit the Capitol in Huntsville, to not only see Constitution Village, but take the walking tour along these shady streets and see some of these really beautiful homes. So, Bibb is busily selling forest down on the Alabama River, and the Capitol's getting ready to move there. Cahaba was a high ground, nice high ground on the river, the site of a Mississippian Indian village, a large Indian village, and it was fine plantation country. Bibb wasn't fooling when he said that they could sell and make lots of money at Cahaba. He did. You have never seen such a frenzy of land buying in all of your life, we're told. He used the street names from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to name the streets of Cahaba. He was so proud that things were working out as well as, even better than he had hoped. But he never saw it come to completion. He was 38 years old, suffering from tuberculosis, was out riding on his plantation one day. He fell from his horse. He lingered on a bit, but died. And with him, the prospects of Alabama's first permanent capital being actually permanent died with him. It lingered on, Cahaba. It lingered on for a few years, and but you could tell it was a dead man walking. It was not going to last, and but it unlike St. Stephen's, it didn't just drop and blow away when the capital actually moved. There were, if you have been to Cahaba, some of you probably have, you know it's sort of a ghost town. There are streets, and you can see pictures of all these fancy buildings, and where this was, and where that was, and where the famous columns are. And I've been there several times, and I used to think, before I worked on this book, that those were remnants of the Capitol. Well, that's not exactly right. None of that stuff is from the Capitol days. There were no cameras in the Capitol days. There were no pictures made. In fact, there's a couple of drawings of the first Capitol, but don't trust them. They were drawn from some dimensions that were written down. And Linda Derry, who's the archaeologist there, was telling me that during some digs they did in the bicentennial celebration, that they found the foundation of the Capitol, and it didn't look like the renderings that are in history books and so on. So I don't know what it looked like. She didn't tell me exactly what was different, But I can tell you, the only thing that remains is this cupola. Most people say it is, but there's no documentation that really is. It's on a church in Lounsboro. It seemed the old Capitol, after the government left, the old Capitol was given to the county and used for a county seat for a while, and it finally just fell down. This church got this cupola and took it by wagon and by boat up to Lounsboro, where it now sits on St. James CME Church. You can see it. That's what most people think was top of the first Capitol. The second life of Cahaba was a cotton boom town. Big mansions, rich folks, big cotton plantation owners. It was right there on the river. It was cotton warehouses. It was a boom town, if ever there was a boom town. And these are you can see from these streets. And the streets are still there. There are three cemeteries. One is Black Cemetery, one's the New White Cemetery, and one is the State Capitol era White Cemetery. All three are available. But that cemetery is about the only thing from the original Capitol area that you can see there. You can see the outline of where the Capitol stood. That's about it. This is St. Luke's, and it's a recreation of the church that was there a long time ago. And the Fambro House, again, from the plantation here, and the Cochrane Columns. Well, before I get off to Tuscaloosa, I want to tell you about a third life that Cahaba had. It was during the Civil War. Cahaba really did start dying permanent death with the onset of the war, because there was the cotton business dried up, people wanted a way to buy it. And Cahaba became a prisoner of war camp called Castle Moore. It was part of a cotton warehouse, and they improved on it. They had made it a prison. It was built for 500 prisoners. 3,000 were there, but even so, it had only a 2% death rate, and that's credited to the superintendent, who was a devout Methodist who believed in treating his fellow man humanely and kindly, no matter whether he was a friend or a foe. Well, near the end of the war, there was a prisoner exchange, and the prisoners of Castle Morgan were part of that. They were marched off to Vicksburg, a port on the Mississippi River, where river boats would come and take prisoners and carry them back north to their homes. Well, as they were waiting in Vicksburg to catch a boat, a river boat came into Vicksburg to have its boiler fixed. And while it was there under repairs, the captain heard from one of the prisoner exchange leaders that he could make $5 a head for enlisted man and $10 a head for officers for each one that he could load on his boat and carry upriver, get them back to their homes. The captain heard that, and he said, "Boys, just throw a patch on that boiler because we're headed north." The next day, he loaded them up. Now, the Sultana was a big boat. It had room for 376 souls. He loaded it with 2,472. They got almost to Memphis when the boilers exploded. 1,700 died. It was sort of an ironic end to the many who had survived the rigors of Castle Morgan at Cahaba, only to die on their path to freedom. Well, I need to move on to Tuscaloosa. I'm afraid I'm getting behind. I don't even know how long this is supposed to go. Uh, Colby, should I pause for questions here?
If you'd like to, I actually had one. Someone who is having trouble with their chat. They were wondering if you knew why Birmingham, being such a large city that it is, was never a capital of Alabama. It's the most populated city, but it never was a capital.
Well, it was too late in getting born, I think. Birmingham didn't come into existence until what, 1872, something like that. And by then, Montgomery was so entrenched in the capital. And the love of Montgomery as the capital has to do with the sentiment toward the Civil War during that point. Once the Confederate Memorial was built and all this Confederate stuff happened at the old Capitol, you couldn't have moved the capital out of Montgomery with dynamite by that point. Oh, there was some discussion. You know, Birmingham, they had Capitol Park is now the park between the courthouse and Birmingham City Hall. But I think that was just wishful thinking on the people of Birmingham. It was never going to move. If Birmingham had been founded in 1840, it very well could have been, but just too late. Not too little, but too late. Any others? Oh, how long should we go?
Take as long as you need. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and unless anyone wants to pipe in here and give one, I think that you're good to keep going.
Okay. Well, let's move on to Tuscaloosa. And Justice Clay's committee had recommended several years earlier the capital did move. And there was a lot of discussion in the legislature, and there were a lot of reasons given by the legislature. They said they needed to move out because there were bad floods. Not true. There was a little flooding, but it wasn't like they made it out. They just politicized the reason for the move. It said that yellow fever was bad in the summer. That was true. That was probably good enough reason to move it itself. But mainly, the growing and shifting population of what was Alabama had garnered enough votes to create the movement. And I'm going to tell you about the almost birth of Tuscaloosa first. Nobody really knows who the founder of Tuscaloosa was. I think it was kind of involved. There was an almost founder. Davy Crockett lived in Tennessee and fought in the Creek War, and he knew about this place called the Falls of the Black Warrior, where there had been a large creek village. And he thought it was just a wonderful spot for a town. So he gathered some of his friends, and they came down the Great Tennessee Pike, which went right by the Falls of the Black Warrior. Rode down to scout it out and see if they might start a town. They bedded down for the night, and for some reason the horses spooked and started running back from whence they came. The next morning, Crockett told his friends, said, "Y'all stay here, look around, see what you think. I'll chase down the horses and bring them back." So he began on foot, headed back east. He'd pass a cabin, and they said, "Need any horses?" He said, "Yeah, they're just a little bit ahead of you." So he kept going. And then by the middle of the day, or maybe it was the next day, he was feeling very poorly. And laid down beside the road to see if he could get feeling better. Some Indians came by and said, "Man, you look bad." He said, "I don't feel good either." He said, "Well, we got some watermelons. How about eating watermelon? That'll sure make you feel better." He said, "Oh, I don't even feel good enough to eat watermelon." If you don't feel good enough to eat watermelon, you surely gonna die. And they went on. Later, someone else came and took him to a home near today's Bessemer. They put him in the bed. The family tried to take care of him. He was bad sick. The woman treated him with a patent medicine that was around for many years and well considered, called Bateman's drops. Well, she'd give him a few drops, and he didn't seem to get better. Lingering along. Finally, she said, "I'm just going to give him the whole bottle. It might kill him, but if I don't do something, he's going to die anyway." So she gave him a whole bottle of Bateman's drops. And Crockett didn't die. He slowly got better, a little bit better, a little bit better, and finally he was back to health. Now, it is almost certain that Bateman's drops had nothing to do with his return to health, but he probably did feel a lot better after she gave him that bottle, since the primary ingredient was opium. Yeah, but anyway, he hitched a ride back to Tennessee. When he arrived, it was much to the surprise of his wife and friends, because they said several people had come and sworn that they saw him dead and buried in Alabama. But he told them, he said, boys, after that, I don't think we're going back. Much as I want to do a city there, just can't do it. I wondered after what happened on his trip to Texas, if he was thinking about maybe Alabama wasn't such a bad idea. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a quick story about one of the governors in Tuscaloosa, a man named John Gale. He was governor from 1831 to 1835. And I hope this just illustrates how these people of our state and state government wind and twist and the kind of leadership and the interesting events that happened to them in this era. He was the father of a woman named Amelia Gale. And Amelia was a, what would you call her, a precocious little child. She, once she got a pony for her birthday, was so proud of it, she rode it into the Capitol and into the governor's office so she could show it to her daddy. He was not amused. She would slip around town and peek into the bars and taverns and listen to the political gossip. And she also had to watch her mother die. It was horrible and painful death. Her mother, Sarah, was having some tooth trouble and went to the dentist. And unfortunately, the dentist had not properly cleaned his equipment. And Sarah caught lockjaw. I know not much about it, except that it apparently is very painful. And Amelia had to listen and watch as her mother died in screaming agony. And from that point forward, Amelia was terrified every time she had to go to the dentist. But anyway, Amelia grew up. She married the head of ordnance during the Civil War, a man named Josiah Cordus. After the war, Amelia ran the Briarfield Furnace for a time. And when Josiah became the president of the University of Alabama, she became the librarian there. And so beloved that when you go there today, you will see her name across the top of the University of Alabama library. Now, I don't know if we have any women listening today, and particularly any who went to the University of Alabama, but I want to tell you a story about it. It'll come back around. Julia Tutwiler, Alabama's leading crusader at the time, this was 1892, was incensed that only men could attend the University of Alabama. And somehow she wrangled a meeting with the trustees, talked to them about that. And she did. And she went in to see them, and I want to read to you exactly what she told that body. Quote, "There seems to be an obvious injustice in the fact that the most stupid boy at Alabama can obtain at our state university an education without paying tuition, and the most brilliant girl is disbarred from this privilege." Well, Julia won the day. And if you are a woman, and if you attended the University of Alabama, you have her to thank. You also have somebody else to thank. Julia had come to Tuscaloosa for this meeting the night before it happened. And she spent the night with her good friend, Amelia Gordis. And the two of them stayed up all night working out the wording for Julia's presentation the next day. So thank Julia Tutwiler, but also thank Amelia Gale Gordis, the daughter of the governor. Well, John Gale, the governor, was also grandfather to Amelia's world-famous son, William Crawford Gordis, the conqueror of yellow fever. I'll give you one more story on Governor Gale. The Creeks during these 1830s, the Creeks were about to go to war again. The settlers were just moving into the Indian territory on the east side of Alabama, right and left, and it seemed like nobody could stop them. And there was some violence taking place. Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, decided to send an emissary down. Francis Scott Key, yes, same one who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, sent him down as an emissary to fix things up. But Gale hated it. This sounds familiar. How many governors have we heard complain about federal interference in state affairs in Alabama throughout the years? There's nothing new. So Key got things fixed up. Gale never liked it, but he did. But Key apparently got along a lot more famously with Gale's wife and children than the governor, because he visited them often and had long and lively conversations with Sarah Gale and the children, and he read and wrote poetry to them. Tuscaloosa today is ruins. It caught fire. The Capitol was a beautiful structure. It was a beautiful structure, and it was after the Capitol left and went to Montgomery, it was given to a college. Caught fire, and this is what remains, and it's in a park, and it's certainly worth visiting, but it doesn't take long. At the bottom of this picture is a mark, and you'll see a number of stones there. Those are the mason's marks. And I guess so the superintendents keep track of which mason did the best work and which one was doing the most work. Anyway, interesting things. So we moved to Montgomery, and the population shifted again. The Indians were sent off on the Trail of Tears, and suddenly Alabama widened, and the center of the state moved east. When the legislature decided to leave Tuscaloosa and go to Montgomery, when they decided to leave Tuscaloosa, they didn't decide to go to Montgomery. There were many votes. There were cities all around that wanted a chance to be the capital. It took a lot of votes for Montgomery to finally win. And it was, they were so thrilled. They were so thrilled to get the capital that they offered to give the government a free capital. They did. It was a beautiful building. It was built on top of Goat Hill. Lasted 2 years. Burned down. Some people thought it might have been arson. That a person who was angry about leaving Tuscaloosa burned it down in hopes that the government would decide to just move back. And others thought it was just an accident, that a chimney was too close to a beam and caught fire and burned. Whatever the case, the legislature learned that they had forgotten to insure the building. And so this time, people of Montgomery were not inclined to give them a new building. They were on their own. Let me tell you about Andrew Dexter. That Goat Hill wasn't picked by accident. Andrew Dexter was a fellow from the north in the banking and construction business. And he was not always the most upright fellow and got in trouble with his banking, and he and his wife had to go to Canada for a while to escape prosecution. Years passed. He came back after a while and had a bittersweet moment. The bitter part, his daddy died. The sweet part was his daddy left him a lot of, I guess you'd call it, script. It gave him the right to buy a lot of land down in what was to become Alabama with next to nothing, which he did. He was going to build a town right there at the Big Bend in the Alabama River. He divided it up, the land up, subdivided it, began selling lots, houses, and stores. He was successful. But he didn't sell one section, and that was the land at the top of the hill where goats were. On this Goat Hill. And he said, this city deserves to be the capital of Alabama someday, and this land I'm setting aside not for sale, but to be used for that capital whenever the time comes for the capital to go here. Some years later, sure enough, his wishes were honored, and when the capital came to Montgomery, that was the area that was chosen. Now, Dexter Avenue runs right up through the middle of old downtown Montgomery and ends at the Capitol. It used to be called Market Street, but it was named later in honor of Dexter. Now it's Dexter Avenue. Dexter left Montgomery, went out to Texas, did some land deals there, came back to Mobile, died of yellow fever, and they brought his body back, and he's buried in Montgomery now. There's a land room. You know, I'm not doing very good at pushing the button. I should, and I apologize for that. There's a picture looking up Market Street of the Capitol version. Well, now I'm caught up. This was the Capitol. So many things have happened here. It's amazing the amount of stuff that has happened in Montgomery. Here's Secession Day. There's Jeff Davis on the day of his inauguration. And here is the Winter Building, the white building in the background behind the fountain. That building was a telegraph office, and not too long after Jeff Davis took that oath of office, he sent his Secretary of War, Leroy Pope Walker, down to that telegraph office to send a telegram to PGT Beauregard in Charleston, South Carolina, authorizing the firing on Fort Sumter. So the authorization telegram came from still there, still in office. One little sideline, right before daylight, firing started, sitting beside a window was Amelia Gorgas and William Crawford Gorgas, a little boy sitting in her lap. They sat and watched the bombardment as it took place. Anyway, let me tell you about a young fellow. He was 13 years old, Henry Myrick. Got in a fight, got stabbed in the heart. He was going to die. Didn't die right off, but the family finally sent for a guy named Dr. Luther Leonidas Hill, who had done some research in heart surgery. Nobody had ever survived heart surgery, but he was working at it. So they called him, and he said, folks, he said, I don't know if I can save this boy or not. Nobody's ever lived through a heart surgery, but I'm willing to try. I might be able to save him. If I don't do it, he's going to die for sure. So he did. And after less than an hour, he had sewn up that boy's heart, and the boy lived. A couple of weeks later, he was good as new. It was the first successful heart surgery in the United States. Now, a lot of people may not know Luther Leonidas Hill, but most of you probably know his son, Lister, who became a United States Senator and who led the national effort for improved public health and expansion of hospital care. One more quick story. There was a boy, 13 years old, another 13 years old, named Hiram. He and his family moved, he and his mama moved from Greenville to Montgomery for a better life. And she opened a boarding house. Some people said it was a boarding house. And he went down to the corner of Potomac and Montgomery Streets, beside the Jefferson Davis Hotel, where he sold peanuts, shined shoes, and sang. As luck would have it, WSFA radio broadcast from the mezzanine of that hotel, and they heard him, and they thought, well, he's pretty good. And they would feed a microphone out the window down there, and soon enough, this boy's songs were riding the airwaves from there to Pensacola. They called him the singing kid. He didn't like that. He told them, he said, I don't want to be the singing kid. They said, well, what do you want to be? Well, my name. He said, well, I know my name's not good. My name's Hiram. He said, but I don't like that. He said, but I do like going to cowboy movies downtown. And one of the names I like in those cowboy movies is Hank. He said, Hank's a name I can work with. So then, on that moment, Hiram Williams no longer was around, but Hank Williams was there in his place. And he went on to be the Grand Ole Opry's great star and more music hall fames than you could think of. Now, I know I have worn you out and I've abused my time. I apologize, but I will just tell you there, when I was in the newspaper business, anytime something would happen, wonderful, terrible, tragic, miraculous, we'd look at each other and say, well, let's find out how Alabama's involved, because inevitably it will be. And as I finish this book and look back on all these stories and lots of others that are there, I was convinced more than ever of the truth of that statement. This is a state and a government full of stories, and I hope you've enjoyed this view. I'm told to say that this book is available in bookstores all over the state, and these stories are there along with a lot of others. And thank you very much. Colby, any other questions?
Thank you. I don't see any in the chat. If anyone has any, I want to turn on their mic real quick and ask them. We can take questions quickly if anyone has any. Not sure, but.
Sound like they don't have any, or they dropped off.
Well, I'm not sure, but thank you very much, Mr. Bailey. It was very interesting. Again, the book's called The Five Capitals of Alabama, the story of Alabama's capital cities from St. Stephen's to Montgomery. And as he said, you can go pick that up in bookstores around the state. I'm also seeing it available on Amazon. If you want to order one, get it shipped right to your house. Thank you again. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. And
Well, thank you
everyone for being here.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and thank y'all. I hope this worked out. Like I say, I didn't do very well with the PowerPoint. I don't think it kept getting away from me, but I'll do better. And so I learned how to use this thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.